8 May 1945. Bavaria. The ruined communications house smelled of dust and burned paper. Sunlight found through a jagged roof and lay in a pale rectangle on a table where a stack of stamped envelopes had once kept codes and orders. Women in gray coats sat on crates and steps, their hair tucked or bound, faces pinched from months of hunger and tension. Engines rolled beyond the trees, trucks, not tanks, and every now and then a laugh that started as disbelief broke off and became something softer, like the clearing of a throat. Margarite Schulz held her field telephone close to her chest as if it were a small child. She had been trained to listen for pattern and rhythm, the exact cadence of a cipher, the necessary pause before a reply. In the last years, those patterns had become the scaffolding for everything she believed, her place, her meaning. Now the rhythms of the world she knew faltered. From the road came the smell of petrol and, impossibly, something sweet, wrapped in crinkled foil. She could not put a name to it at first. Then a young American soldier lifted a small bar, smiling shyly as if offering a private bravery, and the men and women on the steps leaned forward to see. If this story holds your attention, stay with it to the end, and if you find it meaningful, like and subscribe so more of these histories reach others. The soldier, thin, with a dust-streaked uniform that hung loosely like a borrowed coat, crumbled the foil with a careful thumb and handed a piece to the woman nearest him. She took it as if it might be poisoned, then tasted, then closed her eyes. The sound she made was not a word. It was a small surrender. Marguerite watched the exchange through a lattice of habit. Inventory the scene, note the exchange, classify the action. Her training had taught her where to place things. Herself, auxiliary telegraph operator, 21, steady hands, a medal pinned once for efficient code maintenance, the enemy, always a faceless abstraction, victory, the only permissible thought. The soldier's offer was an anomaly. He should have been the enemy. He should have looked the part. Instead, he offered sweetness. For someone raised on slogans and theaters of certainty, sugar offered without calculation was disorienting. Across the yard, a small group clustered around a supply truck marked with a white star. The truck's bed was a patchwork of dented metal and bulging crates. Someone opened one and revealed bread, neatly wrapped, white as if it had been shaved from clouds. Whispers ran like a current through the women. White bread? Chocolate? New boots? The items were ordinary things, but because they were ordinary, they undermined a lifetime of prepared stories. Propaganda had taught them that the enemy hoarded and starved, that abundance belonged only to those who could be hated. Here, abundance arrived in the hands of those who had been taught to be feared. Marguerite could remember the precise lesson in the youth meetings. The enemy was perfidious, the enemy decadent. The enemy's luxuries were proof of moral decay, not material advantage. She could recite the slogans in her sleep. What she could not catalog was the look on the soldier's face as he offered the chocolate, an apologetic sort of pride, a question in his eyes about whether a piece of candy could be reconciled with a rifle. The camp where they had been taken was not a death camp nor a palace. It was a transfer center, a place of sorting and processing for people who, until a few days ago, had been convinced of their own righteousness. Tents stood in regimented rows. There was running water, a crude wash station, buckets of tea. American medics moved with efficiency, a tidy language of patches and tags, needles and needles labels. The layout itself spoke of logistics, supply chains, inventories, and arithmetic that could not be argued away by slogans. This arithmetic, when made visible, would prove decisive in ways that the women were only beginning to sense. Helga Weber had seen war as something else entirely. She had been a nurse in a field hospital north of Munich, the kind of place where the human body was a ledger of choices and scarcity. She measured her life in bandages, how many per wound, which ones could be improvised, when a dressing would have to be reused. She had been taught to be inventive, because there was no other option. Her hands had learned the geometry of makeshift surgery. Helga's face still carried the traces of those nights, dark crescents under her eyes, a steady, practiced calm that hid a core of fury at the helplessness she had been pressed into. When American medical personnel first arrived at the hospital she worked in, there had been a peculiar combination of shame and curiosity among the German staff. They had bragged privately and hurriedly about their resourcefulness, how they managed without, how they stretched, how they held a line. They told stories of making do. They counted improvisations like medals. Helga had believed in that narrative, believed that suffering could be dignified into heroism. Then a supply convoy rolled into the field and set down crates marked with familiar names in a foreign hand. Morphine, penicillin, sterilization kits. The sight of glinting vials, numbered, labeled, abundant, was like a mathematical solution to a problem she had learned to accept as insoluble. How many, she asked once, not to test the man who handed her a tray, but because numbers had become for her a way to anchor outrage. How much more had they had? The American medic, calm and courteous, scribbled on a pad and told her plainly what she had not expected to hear. The figure was not an accusation. It was an inventory. It was the kind of thing that could not be sung away. In the days that followed, Helga watched the orderliness of the American medical tent and felt something uncoil within her. Where she had expected cruelty, she found protocol. Where she had expected mockery, she found instruction. An American nurse named Sarah Thompson taught her how to open a sterile pack without contaminating it, how to read dosage instructions, and how to count morphine vials so that they could be tracked and replaced. There was no theatrical contempt in the lessons, only a firm insistence on standards. Meanwhile, on a flatbed inside the camp, Captain James Morrison prepared to speak. He would not offer a sermon or a patriotic lecture. He would lay out logistics, charts pinned to a wooden easel, numbers arranged in a manner familiar to any clerk or commanding officer, vehicles, tons of fuel per week, crates of medical supplies, the cadence of shipments. For Margarite, who trusted her eyes for the cadence of encrypted messages, the charts promised the same kind of clarity. For Helga, who had lived by approximate counts and hunches, the numbers were an invitation to rationalize grief. Captain Morrison's voice was steady. He spoke without flourish. His authority derived from detail. "We moved this many trucks across these roads," he said, pointing to a series of figures. "We supplied this many beds, this many bandages, this many meals." The war was won not only by battles, but by machines of production and transport. He unfolded a map in which the arteries of supply were drawn like rivers. You can see here the frequency of convoys, the tonnage per week, the replacement rate for vehicles. A photograph of a storage yard flashed, rows and rows of boxed supplies, canvas covers lifting like small hills. The women leaned forward, some with eyes blank with hunger, some with mouths that tried to form questions but couldn't. Marguerite's trained mind started its calculus. If so many trucks could carry so many supplies, then how had the idea been lodged in her head that the enemy starved? The numbers had the bluntness of arithmetic. They were not moral truths, but material facts. They deflated slogans. The American sergeant nearby, Robert Mitchell, who moved among the women with a watchful, patient air, answered questions with a kind of modesty. He was not there to gloat. He passed out blankets and extra rations, and when a woman asked him why his uniform was so clean after months of war, he laughed and said, "We get new ones every so often. We patch what we must, but mostly we keep things going." The smallness of the answer made the point larger. Maintenance and replacement were routine. This was, in its way, as unromantic as accounting, and twice as devastating for people taught to judge the world by spectacle. Rumors had traveled faster than armies. In the weeks before, whispers had clustered in doorways. Tales of enemy depravity, accusations of unimaginable violence, stories that justified hatred and explained scarcity. Some of these rumors were the result of fear. Others were the kinds of half-true stories that grow in the absence of verifiable information. In the processing tent, a photograph was set down on a table. It showed, from a distance, a line of boxes and a tumbled pile of objects whose shape suggested smallness and abandonment. No graphic detail was displayed. There was no need. The photograph invited viewers to fill the gaps themselves with what they had heard. Some did, some didn't. Professor Elizabeth Warner stood beside the easel with a sheaf of documents. Her manner was an exacting one, calm, emphatic, with a tone meant to anchor rather than inflame. She had worked with Allied investigators during the last weeks to assemble records, train manifests, Nazi directives, lists of supplies confiscated from occupied territories. Her job in the tent was to lay out, in sober terms and with evidence, what the world had been quietly, monstrously doing. She did not shout. She showed. "When you see a list," she said, "it is not a story. It is a series of decisions." She flicked a page and the women saw columns of type, dates, quantities, destinations. Each line names a transaction. Each transaction left someone without. Evidence is not accusation alone. Evidence is a witness. For many of the women, these documents were the first time a systematic account had been presented in such a way. They had been taught to absorb the grand narratives of greatness and betrayal, not the ledger of decisions. The ledger made responsibility legible. It did not absolve individuals immediately. The moral arithmetic that followed would be painfully slow. That first night in the camp, Margarite sat with strangers under a roof that smelled faintly of diesel and tea. A young auxiliary named Erica whispered translations into the ears of those who still clung to earlier certainties. Several women tried to reconstruct earlier orders, to remember the last radio broadcast they had heard that had told them to hold firm. They compared what they had been told with what they had seen. There were inconsistencies. Supply trucks where they expected sieges, medical tents where they had been taught they would find only mockery. Margarite began to count, not out loud, but in her head, an old habit. She had a talent for numbers. In school, she had been the one who could do long sums without losing track. Counting now was not a comfort. It was a weapon she pointed at herself. If one truck could carry X, and if X multiplied by Y convoys equaled Z tons per week, then where had the story of purposeful starvation come from? Who had benefited from the creation of that story? The math offered a new way to question authority. Helga found herself in the American medical tent as if by gravity. Lieutenant Sarah Thompson worked the ward with a brisk efficiency that would have seemed abrasive if not for a steadiness that displaced it. She showed Helga how to open a small glass ampule without shattering it, how to tilt the vial and draw out a precise dose. Helga's hands trembled only once, when she touched a vial labeled penicillin, and the American nurse caught the tremor without comment. There was no triumph in the act of teaching, only a determination to share knowledge. "It keeps infections from becoming deaths," Sarah said plainly, "but it has to be given properly. We count doses, we record, we don't waste more than we must." The sentence was a lesson in accountability. Helga understood that the difference between the hospitals she had known and this one was not merely quantity but procedure. Someone here had thought through the chain: manufacture, distribution, dosing, replacement. Procedure multiplied compassion into results. One afternoon, a small group of women were invited to a demonstration. Private Tommy Chen, assigned to guard the processing camp, guided a cluster of onlookers toward a row of trucks whose sides bore stenciled labels. He pointed to the letters and said, in a mix of halting German and gestures, that each crate had been recorded, serial numbers, receiving signatures, destinations logged by time. It was astonishing to people who had lived under a regime where secrecy and spectacle had been preferred to straightforward accounting. The ordinary, day-to-day bureaucratic care of the occupiers, keeping lists, checking boxes, read like an act of decency. In the evenings, around the latrine lights, conversations turned to memory. The younger women, barely into their 20s, compared uniforms and badges as if for fashion, while older ones tried to explain the years of certainty. Margarite found herself speaking rarely, thinking more. She recalled the fervor with which some teachers held posters of enemies and allies like gospel. She remembered the orchestral quality of film rallies, the drumbeat of speeches. Now, confronted with small American kindnesses, a bar of chocolate, a blanket, a steady supply of clean dressings, her memory felt both naive and guilty. Not all the women accepted the new reality quickly. Some clung to slogans as if to a rope thrown to them in a storm. They would watch the soldiers and mutter that propaganda and perfidy were the same. They would point to the presence of Americans and insist it was yet another proof of foreign cunning. Denial preserved a certain psychological coherence. If everything else one believed was shattered, so too would be the identity tied to those beliefs. For those who had built a self on doctrine, the collapse threatened a personal ruin as much as a public shame. The confrontation that would matter most took place in the tent where Professor Warner showed photographs and documents. The professor did not flash graphic images. She did not need to. A single photograph of abandoned shoes, a row of badges, the silhouette of a child's toy was enough to make people look away. Margarite remembered the sound of the rustling pages as if it were a closing of curtains. Faces shifted, some reddening with anger, some pale with nausea, some simply blank for a long, stunned minute. A woman seated beside Margarite, an older auxiliary named Anna, breathed as if to speak, then stopped. Her lips moved soundless. "We were told they were criminals," she finally whispered, the word heavy with the weight of her confusion. "We were told stories. But we did not need to know this," she said, gesturing at the images. Her voice was not seeking absolution, it was searching for a map back to herself. Margarite could not find a map. She had the compulsion instead to measure. She pulled from memory the last figures she had been given in training, propaganda numbers that boasted of imagined enemy atrocities to stiffen resolve. Here, Professor Warner presented reproductions of rail manifests and lists of items requisitioned from across territories, boots taken from villages, statements signed by officials. The documents were dry, bureaucratic, and therefore truthful in a way that drama was not. They named dates and signatures. They traced mechanisms. "What does this mean for us?" someone asked then, not as accusation, but as a query. It was an honest question. It required a kind of civic responsibility that the women had not been prepared to accept, to reckon individually with participation in a system that had perpetrated terrible things, even when one's hands had not directly committed those acts. For Margarite, the moral arithmetic proved both simple and excruciatingly complex. She had been a cog in a machine that sent orders, not death, though the orders justified and concealed acts. To accept that was to accept complicity by association and by silence. She thought of the times she had carried messages without questioning, of the small moments she had rationalized. "I was following orders," as if obedience could absolve awareness. Helga's reckoning took a different shape. In the sterile light of the American ward, she found the possibility of a professional rebirth. She began to study American charts on sterilization and dosing, to learn the differences in how records were kept. She saw that the difference between life and death often hung not on heroism but on method. The American nurses taught her how to ask for evidence, how to insist on supplies, how to keep a ledger. For Helga, this was not merely a technical education. It was a reclaiming of agency. She could not undo what had happened on the battlefields, but she could improve the future by adopting practices that reduced harm. There was a small private moment that captured the moral dislocation better than any lecture. Margarite sat near a field stove, her hands in the pockets of her coat. A small American boy, no more than 10, scraped face, a uniformed father in the background, handed her a folded piece of paper. It was a letter, written in careful block letters, from a soldier far from home. The boy had been taught to make small gestures. Marguerite unfolded the paper, and the first line read simply, "I hope you can eat this without fear." It was not a philosophical proposition, it was a human request. She opened the wrapper of the chocolate and took a bite. The taste was immediate and unmapped. Tears pooled to the edges of her eyes before she could understand why. Around her, other women chewed in silence. Some inhaled as if they had been given air. The sweetness unspooled the tight nerve of indignation and revealed an ache, for comforts denied, for trust misplaced, for truths withheld. After that, the camp taught in a different register. The lectures continued. Captain Morrison laid out figures, Professor Warner displayed documents. But there were also small classes where mechanics showed how engines were maintained, where nurses taught basic wound care, where clerks explained manifesting. These lessons had a pedagogical aim, to give the women tools to survive, yes, but also to show the world as it was organized. The logic of supply and repair is not glamorous, but it explains why armies win and why structures of cruelty can be sustained or dismantled. Marguerite found herself in a classroom one morning, a crude board at the front, Morrison's voice steady as numbers. He sketched a simple arithmetic on the board. If a truck carries X tons and travels Y times a week, the total haul is X times Y. Then multiply across the number of trucks and the duration of campaigns. He did not cast this as moral argument. He presented it as method. Wars, he said, are logistics. You can have courage, but if your fuel and food are gone, courage does not move the wheels. She had never considered that the speeches and fervor were one thing, and the physical, prosaic movement of supplies was another. Propaganda had taught her to conflate spectacle with essence. The arithmetic suggested that the essence belonged to those who kept the wheels turning: clerks, drivers, factory workers, mechanics, people whose names were never sung in the rallies. There was also the question that hung over everything and could not be avoided: what to do when confronted with evidence of wrongdoing by one's own side. Professor Warner did not give an easy answer. Knowing is the first step, she said. Responsibility follows. How each person acts is their own decision thereafter. The sentence carried no moral theater. It offered instead a sober demand. Marguerite sat with the demand for weeks as if it were an illness to be diagnosed. She wrote a letter to her sister the night before she left the camp, a brief note that tried to assemble, in first person, the fracture of belief. It read, "I do not know how to say all of this. The men who brought us here are not monsters in the way we were taught. They are people with lists and schedules and rules. They give what they carry, and they keep accounts. I ate chocolate that tasted like the world I had been denied. I do not yet forgive myself for how easy it was to believe. Tell Mother I am learning to count things differently." She hesitated over the signing. The letter was not an apology to the absent dead. It was a confession to someone she trusted, a small attempt to name the change. She mailed it from the camp with hands that trembled. The sending was a tiny act of responsibility, not to atone, but to document that her understanding had shifted. Helga's progression led her further into practical service. She learned to keep detailed patient records, to dye bandages cleanly, to request supplies in a manner that would be respected and fulfilled. She joined the American ward in an official capacity, first as an observer, then as a collaborator. The ration of pride she took in mastering new techniques was tempered by the knowledge that such learning made her complicit in a different story, the story of a people learning from those they had been taught to fear. That complexity sat heavy on her. It did not absolve her of past beliefs, but it gave her a path forward. Not everyone in the camp would take the path. There were bickers and fights, older men and women who refused to accept records, who tore down posters, who raged that the world had been stolen from them. Some escaped into denial because it was easier than grief. Others converted their shame into quiet endurance, choosing to rebuild in private. The presence of the Americans complicated all of this. They were both occupiers and caretakers, conquerors and providers. People struggled to reconcile the duality. One morning, just before the crowds were to be bussed away, Margarite walked to the truck bed and opened a crate. Inside were olives jars, canned meat, bars of a soap that smelled of lavender and cleaning fluid together. She touched the label, turned it over. On the crate, stenciled letters marked ownership, origin, destination. The orderliness felt like a lesson in itself. The world could be cataloged and thus known. If the world could be known, then truth was not only an oral commandment, but an artifact that could be examined, weighed, and recorded. She allowed herself then a small private mercy. Opening a Hershey wrapper once again, she placed a piece on her tongue and let the sugar dissolve into the space where slogans had once lived. The sensation was not simply pleasure. It was an admission of vulnerability. It was also, she realized, an acceptance of the possibility that ordinary kindnesses might exist outside the stories she had been taught to expect. To accept that was to open oneself to a dangerous empathy. The day they were to be released, Professor Warner said quietly that there would be more evidence shown later, in different towns and different tents. This is not the end of education, she said. It is the beginning of being accountable to what we know. The women filed onto trucks, passports, or the rough military equivalents, checked by hands that had learned the specificity of signatures. For many, the journey home would not be a return to the same mind. Some would carry guilt like a stone. Others would carry the new practices of nursing and record-keeping into Reconstruction. A few would cling to denial with the stubbornness of those who fear surrender. As Margarite sat on the truck, the landscape passing in a blur of ruined roofs and flowering fields that had not been touched by human enmity, she reached into her bag and took out the letter she had written to her sister. She smoothed it with a finger. It had no novelty. It was not a manifesto. It was a simple human artifact, an accounting of love and confusion. She read it once more and then folded it back into its envelope. Behind the truck, as dust clouded, an American medic beneath his helmet lifted the small bar of chocolate he had been given, as if acknowledging that the exchange between people could be more than symbolism. It could be a bridge. Margarite watched him, then unwrapped the piece she had held back. She put it into her coat pocket, not to eat, but to keep as a record of a moment when the world had dislodged itself from the story she had been taught. She thought of the arithmetic Captain Morrison had written on the board, and of the quiet competence of Lieutenant Sarah Thompson instructing nurses on proper wound dressing. She thought of Professor Warner's steady pages and the photographs that had made choice legible. She thought, finally, of the letter in her pocket and what it meant to tell someone else that a life could be reorganized around evidence. On the road out of the camp, a small child waved from a farmhouse, and the truck driver tipped his hand. Margarite, who had been trained to listen for patterns, began to notice patterns of a different kind, gestures of human decency repeated so often that they no longer seemed exceptional. Perhaps the lesson of those days was not that all had been simple, but that complexity required a discipline, to ask for numbers, to demand receipts, to refuse the comfort of stories when faced with documented facts. She folded that thought and slid it into the pocket where she kept her letter. She did not know then how her life would unspool. Would she be forgiven by those who had loved her? Would she forgive herself? Those were questions with no immediate answers. But she understood, with a clarity that felt hard-won, that the work ahead would be an act of labor, to rebuild, to record, to teach a younger generation that evidence matters. As the truck jolted over a rutted road, Margarite unwrapped the last piece of chocolate she had saved, and offered it to the man sitting opposite her, a German civilian with soot on his face, a look of bewildered hope, who accepted it with a nod that was almost a prayer. The sweetness did not solve anything. It only reminded them that the smallest human acts could loosen the hold of lies. She closed her eyes for a moment, tasting sugar and dust, and then opened them to a sky that seemed, absurdly, to have been washed. The reality of the day, of lists and trucks and orphaned photographs, had pressed upon her a single demand: to prefer evidence to seduction, to ask for numbers and receipts rather than slogans. It was a small ethic for a vast task, but it was a beginning. They drove past a field where men were stacking crates with practiced hands. Those crates would be unpacked and inventoried and sent on to other tents and other towns. The machinery of supply, once visible, could not be unseen. Margarite thought of the engines and the grease-streaked fingers in the workshops, people whose unromantic labor had decided battles. It was an anatomy of victory, not of triumph in the romantic sense, but of sustained, patient work. A hush had settled among the passengers, the kind that follows a naming. Each woman in the truck kept her own private ledger now, of guilt, of questions, of small inherited responsibilities. The camp had not turned them into saints. It had offered instead a clearer lens through which to see what had been done and what might yet be mended. As the convoy began to slow near a crossroads, Margarite reached into her coat once more, not for chocolate this time, but for her field telephone, a talisman of her past life. She pressed it to her ear, not to transmit, but as if to touch memory. The device was battered, its cords frayed. She thought of the pattern of its clicks and pauses, and of how the pattern had taught her to trust a voice in the dark. Now the world demanded a different kind of listening, to records, to receipts, to the arithmetic of supply and demand. She kept the phone with her when she stepped down into the dust. The sun made a small glare on the horizon. Sound carried differently now. The rumble of the departing trucks, the distant call of a bell at a station, a child's laughter that might have been joy or might have been something else entirely. Margarite stood, feeling both fragile and compelled. She had been given no absolution. She had been, instead, handed facts. It was a poor substitute for certainty, but better than false comfort. She unfolded the letter to her sister one last time, and in a small private act added a single line at the bottom: "From now on, ask for the numbers." Then she sealed the envelope, not as a declaration of finality, but as a humble instruction, an ethic for those who would have to live with the past and, perhaps, rebuild on firmer ground. She put the letter back into her coat and, with the others, walked toward the village where home might still be waiting, or where home might have been. The Hershey wrapper crinkled in her pocket like a small, ordinary testimony to a day when something fundamental had shifted. She could not yet predict the shape of the person she would become, only that she would carry the habit of asking for lists, for manifests, for receipts of what was done in the name of a nation. It was a simple practice, but it might keep others from stitching lies into lives. The sun dropped a little as they walked. In the distance, someone set down a chalkboard and students began to crowd toward it. Captain Morrison's voice carried a little across the field, explaining with the patience of a clerk how convoys were scheduled. The world, in its prosaic engineering, continued to move. For Margarite, the movement was an invitation, a daily, demanding task to prefer evidence to comfort, to favor the arithmetic that tells what was actually done over the theater that tells you why you must feel proud. She felt the weight of that invitation as she lifted her face to the sky and began to walk. She moved toward the cluster of canvas and rough timber where a lamplight already burned. The school children pressed close to the chalkboard like survivors around a small fire of letters. A boy looked up at her and, seeing the Hershey wrapper in her hand, smiled with the shy, immediate commerce of hunger. She broke the chocolate, offered half. He took it without ceremony and held it like a treaty. Captain Morrison waited near a table strewn with lists. He wore the same tired, efficient expression she had come to trust, a man who believed that order could be fashioned out of ruin if someone kept tally long enough. "We'll set up a register by the supply tent," he said when she approached. "Names, goods, destinations. Every crate counted twice. You'll help if you want." Her throat tightened, not with fear, but with a steadier thing, the awareness that permission had a shape, and that shape was work. She nodded. The field telephone, cold and familiar, seemed suddenly less like memory and more like a tool she might still use. They led her through the lanterned paths where soldiers stamped the mud from their boots, where women sorted blankets, and small battered crockery gleamed under oilcloth. Inside the tent, the air smelled of paper and coffee and the faint metallic tang of ink. A ledger lay open, its pages dog-eared from hurried entries. Margarite set down the letter to her sister on the table, smoothed the corner with a finger, and then reached for a pen. She began to copy a name and a number, the first small act in what she hoped would become a habit, a quiet insistence that the past be accounted for, that likenesses of truth might be stitched into the accounting of the world. The night outside was patient. Inside, someone whispered the tallying into being. They worked by habit and by necessity. Names, numbers, goods, destinations, one after another until the ledger looked less like a book and more like a claim on the world. Margarite learned the cadence of it. There was a rhythm in the way Captain Morrison pronounced a surname, the soft punctuation of his pen on the paper, the way he tapped the column of figures as though tapping might make them truer. She copied what he dictated, then checked it against the torn manifests that came with the convoys, then checked the manifests against the men who had signed for the crates. When a name repeated, she underlined it. When an address did not match a person, she circled it and left a space for inquiry. At first, the questions were mechanical. A woman from the next tent wanted to know if her husband's boots were logged under a different surname. A young soldier passed through, frantic, because his mother's name had been misspelled and the parcel of medicines had been set aside as undeliverable. Margarite learned to listen for the small sounds of panic that meant something else. The corner of a voice that broke when she read a ledger entry aloud. The furtive way someone would ask if a certain name, one not on any sheet, might nevertheless be found. When they closed up that night, the ledger had swollen with entries. The oil lamp had burned low. The smell of coffee had turned bitter. Captain Morrison folded his hands over the table as if to keep them from touching every loose document within reach. He looked at Marguerite with a curiosity that was almost gentle. "You are steadier than you look," he said. "I learned to count in the dark," she answered. It was true in the small sense and true in the larger. She had grown used to listening for patterns where there had been only chaos, used to trusting an order that others might call cold, but which to her felt like survival. The days became a kind of apprenticeship. She catalogued blankets and rations, inscribed the tiny goods that tied a person to a place. Families came and left, and each time someone passed through the supply tent there was a ritual. To be asked their name, to have their smallness made official by ink on a page. The ledger did something that comfort had not. It made those comings and goings legible. That did not heal, but it prevented erasure. One afternoon a man arrived with a sheet of paper tied in a scrap of cloth. He was middle-aged, shoulders stooped as if the burden were older than his own life. He did not ask to be sent to a tent or a hospital. He placed his hands on the table and watched as Marguerite unfolded his bundle. On a single page, written in a cramped, urgent hand, was a list of names, 12 in all. Each matched with an account of what had been taken from them. The top of the page bore the name of the village they had come from, and beneath it, as if to prove the rightness of his grief, were the items they had last had: a loaf cut in 4, a calf tethered to a post, a pair of shoes, a small chipped plate. "I need them to be in the book," the man said. His voice did not carry toward pleading so much as toward insistence. "If they are not put down, someone will say, 'They never were there.'" Marguerite read the list and felt the ledger's weight shift under her hands. The man's paper was not a manifest from a convoy. It was an inventory of absence. She wanted to tell him that things in the ledger had to be verifiable, that the accounting of distribution and the accounting of loss were separate practices. But she had learned, with the ledger open before her, that what was verifiable often began as testimony. "Give me the names," she said. She wrote them, slowly, leaving a margin for remarks. For each name she noted what the man had told her, the last known place, the item lost, whether there was a witness. She did not pretend to make these things facts by writing them. She made them knowable. That, she thought, was a first mercy. Not all who came asked for mercy. Some sought advantage. A crate of sugar had been misdirected the week before, intentionally or not, and the accusation had hung in the air like smoke. Captain Morrison had convened a small count. The men who had signed for the fuel, the driver of the supply truck, the clerk who had tallied the load. There was blame and confusion. There were words sharpened into accusations. Marguerite sat at the table and listened. The ledger, it turned out, could be used as a weapon as well as a shield. A figure miswritten could be used to obscure theft. A manifest with a missing stamp could be used to deny delivery. She found herself cross-checking with a new kind of attention. When an arrival was recorded as unit unknown, she sent a runner to the field to ask who had taken the crate. When signatures were smudged, she remembered faces. The habit of doubt that had kept her from accepting empty consolations now kept her from accepting neat accounts that would let wrongs pass unchallenged. One evening, while she was still at the table, a woman she had seen before came in with a child asleep on her shoulder. The woman's name was Anna, though Marguerite did not know much about her past. Tonight, Anna carried a scrap of linen wrapped around a bundle, and a small wooden box with a latch gone loose. She set the box down and opened it as if laying a small sacred object on the table. Inside were a few letters, a faded photograph of a man whose uniform was worn clean at the shoulders, and a thin strip of cloth with a soldier's insignia pinned to it. "They were supposed to be returned," Anna murmured. "They said the return list would be posted. I went every morning and the paper was not there." Margarite put the photograph beside the ledger and wrote Anna's name. She asked the usual questions. When she came to the column for remarks, she hesitated. What to write? Returned would be false. Awaiting manifest would be bland and unhelpful. "Write what you saw," Anna said. "Write the days you went and the men you asked. Write who told you it was on the way. If they ask if there is proof, you will have my voice." Margarite wrote, "Reported missing. Claimant presents letters and photograph. Visited station repeatedly. Reports of list posted unverified." It was a judicial phrase, but it held the truer smallness of Anna's persistence. The ledger would not return the man, but it might keep Anna's truth from being swallowed. At night she slept fitfully. The ledger lay under the table like a patient animal. In her pocket she kept the sealed letter to her sister, the line she had added that morning scrawled in the margin as if it belonged to a private law. "From now on, ask for the numbers." The instruction was practical and also a reprimand to herself for the sentimental hope she had once entertained. She had not burned the letter. There were things to say that could not be accounted for, and there were things that demanded an account. She had chosen, for now, to gather what could be gathered. A week into her new routine, a name surfaced that did not belong to an arrival nor to a claimant. It was a list entry on a folded manifest, a notation in a different ink tucked between an inventory of planks and a tally of canned meat. The name belonged, apparently, to a unit that had been listed as having received a crate of clothing and then later to have been recorded as having refused the clothes. The notation was a scribble: "Act rect, double, revise." Whoever had written it had not given a reason. Margarite traced the line with her finger. The ledger was a map of small cruelties as much as kindnesses. To record a reversal without a reason was to make a hole in the ledger's fabric where theft or mistake might pass through. She felt, quite suddenly, a fierce concentration. She would not let a reversal pass without cause. She took the manifest to Captain Morrison. He read it over in the lamplight and pursed his lips. "Could be a simple clerical error," he said. His voice carried the comforting possibility of mistake. "Could be," Margarite answered, "but there is a signature on the earlier list and not on the later. There is a smudge in the later, as if someone wanted to make the record look corrected rather than wrong." Morrison studied the smudge. "You want me to question the driver?" "I want you to question anything that looks like it might let things go missing," she said. "If we cannot trust our own lists, we have nothing to stand on." He looked at her then with a patience that was beginning to feel like counsel. "You have learned quickly," he said. "We will trace it." Tracing meant walking the muddy paths to the camp where the crate had been allegedly received. It meant asking men to look in their stores and finding the small pile of clothing that would prove the ledger right or wrong. It meant a day lost to details when the larger project, houses to be inspected, roads to be cleared, children to be fed, pulled for attention. But Margarite had come to see that the days would not yield their truths unless someone took the trouble to look. They found the crate. A unit corporal confirmed the delivery, gestured to a heap of shirts folded on a pallet. The leader of that unit swore they had been airdropped twice and had filed the appropriate receipt. Yet the ledger had been revised, the later entry smudged to indicate a reversal. No one could say who had crossed the name out and for what reason. "You could have spent them," the corporal said. "You could have traded them. You could have had cause to destroy the record." "And if someone did," Margarite answered, "where is the proof of that? A trade needs a counterparty. Destruction leaves witnesses." There was a pause. The corporal looked at the heap of shirts as if seeing them for the first time. Then, without announcement, one of the younger men approached and produced a sheet of paper torn from a ration book. On it was scrawled the same name found in the ledger, and beneath it a simple line: "Issued to Private Heller, signed J." The paper did not explain everything. It did not name J. It did not clarify why the ledger had later been revised. But it made less plausible the notion that the crate had simply vanished into a fog of unrecorded exchange. It offered a thread. Marguerite folded the torn ration sheet and slipped it into the ledger, between the pages where the smudged notation lived. The act felt private and loud at once, like placing a pebble into a machine and hearing it tick differently. She had become the sort of person who stitched scraps of paper into books to keep the world from forgetting. That evening, when the light was thin and the chorus of camp sounds settled into a dull thrum, she opened the sealed letter to her sister. She had not meant to read it again. The seal had only been a household custom that turned the writing into an object, something between private and public. But at the table, after the day of small discoveries, she allowed herself the small comfort of reading the words she had written. The instruction to ask for numbers had been both a counsel to others and a command to herself. She placed the letter back in her coat and went on with the ledger. The tasks before her multiplied, not only to record but to reconcile, to follow signatures, to compare one manifest with another, to speak plainly when the patterns suggested untruth. There was no glory in the work. There were no proclamations. There was instead a string of small, stubborn acts: a pen pressed into paper, a copied name, a note about a witness. On the third night after the discovery, a man came running in, breathless and wild-eyed, with news that would have, under other circumstances, been unbelievable. He claimed that a column of officials had arrived at the main depot, men with authority, with papers that allowed them to requisition supplies and to override counts. They had crossed out entries, they said, and stamped new orders on top of the old. They had been gone before anyone could verify their papers. The ledger sat between Marguerite and Captain Morrison like an exposed nerve. The idea that someone could simply supersede the book, writing over the account, turned the ledger's purpose into a fragile thing. Morrison set his jaw. "Show me what they stamped," he said. The man produced a scrap of paper. There were stamps on it, crude and inked, bearing an insignia Marguerite did not recognize. The stamp itself was not proof of wrongdoing. It might be legitimate. But the ledger, folded open on the table, had no corresponding revision in ink that matched the stamp. The changes had been made in a different hand and with a different pen. The entries had been erased carefully, as if someone knew which lines to take. Marguerite felt, with a clarity that startled her, the shape of a choice. She could let the stamp and the revised entries settle into the ledger, and thereby into the world that would be told of them. Or she could refuse to let the ledger be leashed to the first paper waved before it and insist that every override be accounted for with its own proof. She stood. Outside the tent, the night smelled of wet earth and the low smoke of cooking fires. Inside, the ink on the open ledger shone briefly under the lamp. She thought of the man with the list of the 12 names, and of Anna with her photograph. She thought of the child who had held the Hershey wrapper like a treaty. She thought, too, of the line she had written and sealed in the letter to her sister, an ethic in a sentence. "We document everything," she said. The command in her voice was not loud, but it was steady. If a stamp comes, we keep the stamp, and we get the bearer's name. If a line is erased, we write why. Whoever overrides a ledger must leave their proof behind. Captain Morrison nodded, the way a man nods when he recognizes a necessary stubbornness. "We will not be the ones who make it easy to steal from the ledger," he said. They stayed late into the night, a small council of ink and resolve. They catalogued what had been stamped and what had been erased, scribbled notes by candlelight, and sent a runner to the depot to seek the men who had presented the orders. Marguerite wrote until her hand cramped, and the ledger seemed to take on her fatigue and her fury and make them legible. She was no longer merely copying names, she was marking history, the only way that would survive, by insisting on witnesses and receipts and the slow arithmetic of proof. When they finally blew out the lamp, the ledger lay closed but not concealed. Outside, a dog barked in the dark. Marguerite folded her hands in her lap and felt the ledger's weight as if it were a small altar. She understood now that to ask for numbers was not merely a pragmatism, it was a practice that would, perhaps, in years, form the bones of a community that refused to let memory be overwritten by convenience. She pinned the torn ration slip, the photograph, the scrap with the unknown stamp, into the ledger with a needle of thought. The book was not the truth. It was a record of endeavors against forgetting. She had no illusions that it would stop all wrong, but she had resolved that if wrong came again, someone later might flip through these pages and find at least a trail. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of rain. Marguerite rose, slipped the sealed letter into her coat pocket, and walked out into the night, the ledger's small duty settling in her shoulders like a second skin. Ahead, the path toward the village was dim and intersected with other tracks, prints that would become more legible only if someone kept careful tally. She set her jaw and began to walk.